It wasn't just hunger that the people of Leningrad were facing. There's a city at this stage of 1.5 million people. They failed to evacuate most people, including children, because the city was so totally encircled by the Wehrmacht. No escape. I mean, the city is a vast kind of prison, really. But on top of that, the Wehrmacht have hit the power stations, so the electricity is stuttering, water supply is not certain, and suddenly they're faced with the harshest winter they've seen for decades and decades. The temperatures are starting to drop minus 20, 30, minus 43 degrees centigrade at one point. And there's absolutely unimaginable. That, together with continued bombing and shelling, so the city around them is being dismantled, building by building. The bombing raids leaving everyone absolutely delirious with sleeplessness. Then the hunger on top of that, then the cold on top of that.
Hello. In August 1941, Army Group North of the Wehrmacht approached the suburbs of Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was called. Within days, the city was surrounded, and would remain so for nearly 2.5 years. The suffering endured by its residents was horrifying and included widespread cannibalism. But this is a city of art, architecture, literature, music and dance, the home of Alexander Pushkin, and a place of revolution. Joining to discuss St. Petersburg is writer and historian Sinclair McKay, author of a new book as we discuss the window to the west through the prism of the siege. Plenty more great guests on the way, including Al Murray, Max Hastings and Tessa Dunlop, so please do follow or subscribe, and if you can share with friends and family, I'd be most grateful. But until then, it's me discussing St. Petersburg with Sinclair McKay. Sinclair, great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much for asking me. Very great pleasure to be with you.
I really wanted to speak to you because obviously I'm familiar with your work, but in particular your latest book, St. Petersburg, which I've been reading and really enjoying reading. But I was very keen to speak about because this subject is just so fascinating. But the way you've written about it is quite unusual, actually. It's not a sort of standard history of a siege, is it?
Well, no, because apart from anything else, it wasn't really a kind of standard siege. I mean, it was the worst siege in history to begin with. But the city that was being besieged was, in many ways, one of the most incredibly literate and poetic cities on Earth. So you have this extraordinary mingling of the starkest, darkest horror, the real extremes of kind of human experience, but battled in some ways by people who could have fought it with kind of literature in some weird way.
Yes, I was looking at the photographs in the middle where you have one of a St. Petersburger reading in the public library, which remained open throughout the sort of 900 days of siege.
Yes, I mean, to put it in context, I mean, the siege of Leningrad as the city was then known in the Second World War, I mean, to put it all in context, the Second World War breaks out between Britain and Germany, but you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and Soviet Russia. So Stalin and Hitler come to a kind of a very brittle agreement whereby there's a non-aggression pact. But Hitler had made no secret of his plans for Russia in the East. In Mein Kampf, his prospectus in the 1920s, he had written, "We turn our gaze towards the East." He was endlessly dreaming of conquering Moscow and grabbing all that illimitable land and the oil too, and the agricultural land. And so in the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, broke out. 3 million troops, 3 million Wehrmacht troops, stretched in a line that stretched out for about 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, marching across Eastern Europe, burning, maiming, slaughtering as they went. And Army Group North in the Wehrmacht encircled Leningrad, which is on the northwest tip of Russia, very close to the border of Finland. As St. Petersburg is very close to the border of Finland today, and there are a lot of modern echoes you'll be hearing. And they completely encircled the city. They cut off all the supply routes and all the supply lines, which meant that the roads, the rails, nothing could get through. No food could get through. No supplies could get through. There were aeroplane drops, but the Luftwaffe had mastery of the skies. This was the desperate situation that the people of Leningrad found themselves in 1941.
And so for the German side, I guess it's a big city. It's a vital city. It's a symbolic, as we'll discuss. But
Yeah.
what was the sort of military objective for the Germans?
Well, there were two. When the Germans started out, the original intention was that they should capture the city because, as well as being this incredible architectural jewel at the head of the Baltic Sea, this extraordinary city of palaces and rococo churches and intense color and beauty, it was also a huge manufacturing center. And by 1941, it was absolutely key to the armaments of the Red Army. There were huge factories making tanks. There were huge factories making airplanes. The industry of Leningrad was absolutely key. So the original Wehrmacht Nazi plan was to capture and conquer the city and grab all that vital infrastructure. But then, by the time they had encircled the city, the order had changed. Hitler just simply wanted it wiped off the face of the earth, and he wanted every single living civilian and soldier alike just simply wiped out, either through starvation or by the resulting disease when the bodies started piling up. I mean, the impulse is just as old and as terrible as kind of humanity itself. It just goes right back to the most atavistic kind of impulses, and the city was in essence cut off because geographically, as I say, it's just right at the very northwest tip of Russia. And there was nothing really that the rest of the Soviet Union could do initially in the face of that onslaught. Stalin, when Barbarossa began, apparently, according to his commander Marshal Zhukov, simply sat down heavily in a chair and said nothing. The shock of it was so intense.
And I was reading as well the Finns, because it's very close to Finland, of course.
Yes, yeah.
And the Finns are kind of, I guess they could have provided some kind of assistance, but of course they have no interest in doing that.
No, well, this is in part Stalin had sown the seeds of this particular tragedy for Leningrad, because, as you say, Finland and St. Petersburg, Leningrad, they're very, very close. It's just a matter of just a few miles to the Finnish border through the Karelian Isthmus, which is a beautiful landscape of kind of forest and lakes and kind of reindeer. And as you say, there could have been potentially a supply route through Finland, even if it was only operated in secret by smuggling. But nonetheless, there could have been a route were it not for the fact that in 1939, Stalin launched an attack on Finland. Again, there are some contemporary resonances here because Stalin's idea was that if the Red Army attacked Finland, a country with a population of 5 million people, and conquered it, they could conquer it in 2 days, 3 days, maybe. The Finnish people would simply lay down and die in the face of the all-conquering Red Army, and they would march into Helsinki to the backdrop of a specially composed symphony by Shostakovich, a Finnish symphony. They actually got Shostakovich to compose this. They didn't tell him why, but that was the intention. But as is frequently the case, as we found with Russian rulers who think they're going to conquer a place in 2 or 3 days, it didn't happen. The Finns were ready for him. Tiny population, 5 million, but they've been preparing for years beforehand because of their distrust and loathing of Stalin. They had prepared incredible anti-tank defenses right the way across the border. They had built underground hospitals. They had built up the military in secret. So even though there wasn't conscription, every man basically was completely fully trained. And for a few months, the Finnish army held off the Red Army. Not just held them off, but actually slaughtered them in their hundreds of thousands. It was just absolutely kind of extraordinary. Now, in the end, the Red Army prevailed through sheer weight of numbers. But Finland, by that stage, had been shown the snarling face of Stalinism. They could never, ever be allies after that point. Nor did they fully become allies with the Nazis, although there was an agreement with the Nazis. And it's one of those moments in history, which is a moment of moral horror. You could think, how could they have done that? There were some Finn historians later who said that it's kind of driftwood theory. In geopolitics, there are some countries that are so small that they're driftwood in mighty tides, and that was what was going on in the Second World War. But yes, so the border was completely closed 1941 onwards. The Finns, patrolling the border, would sometimes taunt the Red Army soldiers with cries of "Ruski, Ruski, bread, bread," knowing how desperate the situation was getting. There was real hatred there.
But it is interesting, those contemporary resonances that you've mentioned earlier and throughout the book, particularly, I mean, I guess one that strikes me immediately is the current president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, who is from St. Petersburg, or Leningrad
Indeed,
as it
yes,
was,
yes,
and
yeah.
his brother died during the siege.
Yes, yes. Vladimir Putin would have had an elder brother were it not for the fact, as you say, he died during the siege, and not only just he was a toddler. In fact, the entire ordeal of Putin's parents through the siege is kind of emblematic of the city as a whole. They could provide an illustration. Putin's father was drawn away into the Red Army, naturally. I think actually he was serving with an NKVD division, this is the Secret Service division, but he got injured during the war. I think there was a grenade blast which injured his leg. So Putin's mother, Maria Putina, was left in the city. She, like every other woman, would have been working furiously, possibly holding down 2 or 3 different jobs because all the men were away. So the women had to step in for the manufacturing on rations which were barely more than a handful of bread a day. By the autumn and winter of 1941, sometimes not even a handful of bread. Occasionally, you get a tiny bit of horse meat, maybe the occasional dried apricot, but for each living person, that's all they would have. She and Putin's father had a child called Victor. I think it was in 1940. By 1941, Maria was starving along with hundreds of thousands of others and was getting terribly ill. Victor was removed from her by the state authorities, which happened with quite a lot of children who thought that if they put the children in special institutions, there might be a chance for them to better nutrition. There wasn't. The state couldn't do a better job at all because no one was getting any kind of food through at all. And then Maria Putina was told eventually by the authorities that her son, her little toddler son, had died of diphtheria, more probably starvation, actually, but the authorities would not necessarily admit that. And then consigned to a mass grave because the grave diggers had so little strength left because of their starvation that they couldn't dig into the frozen earth. Mechanical diggers had to dig out these mass graves, which would accommodate thousands upon thousands of anonymous corpses, and toddlers were among them. It's too terrible to contemplate. The grief of a parent is always too terrible to contemplate, really. But the other point about Putin's mother was that she got so ill that at one point she fainted away, and her neighbors assumed that she had died. And so her body was taken out of the tenement building in the center of St. Petersburg, where she lived, and taken to one of the body collection points that they had at the end of certain streets, like bin bags, where the authorities would then come and take away all the bodies, as if in a medieval plague. And it was only one of her neighbors, who spotted her shoes amid that pile of bodies and then heard her very faint moans and suddenly realized, oh heavens, she's not dead, and pulled her out from among that mass of the dead and saved her just in the nick of time. So that's how close she came to being consigned to a mass grave herself. In terms of it's kind of impossible not to wonder, really. Putin himself came along in 1952. His mother by then was 41 years old. His father, after the war, was a railway worker. They were living in a tenement block in the center of post-war Leningrad. And even though, like lots of other people in the ruined, ravaged city, they were quite poor. Life was absolutely not luxurious. They didn't have the lavatories or indoor baths or anything like that. They were still better off than a lot of other people. And Putin got a good education immediately. It's kind of impossible not to wonder about a generational repercussion of trauma. Although it has to be said at the same time, lots of other Leningraders grew up as children in post-war Leningrad, and they didn't grow up to become despotic warmongers. So I don't think that is the kind of unique factor. I think he was clearly, there was something off about him from the start. There's a fascinating account of Putin at primary school, where he got to primary school and he would launch himself into fights, but he would get into fights with much bigger kids, which he clearly couldn't win. But those around him said once the fight started, he couldn't stop. There was just something happened to him, and he became an absolute maniac when fighting. Now he then channeled that into an intellectual career, but this is the Leningrad Petersburg backdrop.
It's so interesting that, because I mean, your book opens with a conversation with a St. Petersburg resident, and I wondered about the relationship that St. Petersburg has with the rest of Russia. In that, if I recall,
Oh, yeah.
and you mention it in the book. I studied Peter the Great, and so this is this city that he founded that was meant to open up Russia to the West. And I was really interested in reading in your book about how, I don't know if resentment's too strong a word, but there's a sort of a
Yeah.
feeling amongst many Russians towards those in St. Petersburg that it's almost it's sort of not quite Russian enough or something.
Yes, well, there are several threads going through that. No, I think resentment isn't too strong a word because I've got several Russian friends, a couple of whom actually live in London, but has of dual nationality and going back and forth kind of via Turkey, that complicated route that you could have to take now. And they come from much deeper within Russia. That's where their kind of family is, and they say, "Oh yeah, no, when it comes to St. Petersburg, it's still very much there. It is kind of resentment because because St. Petersburg even now is so self-consciously aesthetically superior. It's all this kind of ballet and music and art and opera and literature, the endless poetry." And it just has this thing, a sort of snootiness or some hoity-toityness. And the people I know who come from much deeper within Russia say that temperamentally they just much prefer living on the wide Volga in a quiet town rather than just all this kind of airy fairy kind of stuff. That said, they also say that they love visiting St. Petersburg because one of the great draws of the city, apart from the astonishing beauty of it, is that it is very eerie, very uncanny. They say that you can feel the ghosts pressing in on you when you walk down certain streets, and that in itself is a sort of a kind of quasi-philosophical aesthetic pleasure. They're not talking about ghosts of Leningrad. They're not talking about ghosts of horror and atrocity. They're talking more about sort of like some Dostoevsky figures from the 19th century. And I think there was a Petersburg author at the turn of the century called Andrei Bely who said that Petersburg turns its people into shadows, but it also turns shadows into people. There's that brilliant sense of the city that exists on this border between East and West. As you say, Peter the Great, it was envisaged famously as the window on the West. But it's a city that stood on this borderline between Europe and deeper kind of Russia. But there are all sorts of different borderlands in it too, a sense of dislocation of time. There are writers who said that when they walked through St. Petersburg, they felt as if they could have been walking through streets that were centuries older. They couldn't be entirely certain where they were in time. So it exists in its own realm. But yeah, there's a fascinating Russian film made in 2003 called Russian Ark, which is filmed entirely within the Hermitage, the Winter Palace. Beautiful film. You can get it on DVD. It's still available. Millions of extras, incredibly lavish. But at one point, one character in the film says, all this amazing Petersburg architecture, all this amazing art, it's all European. Where's the Russian architecture? Where's the Russian art? And it's just left hanging there. So it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, so how is Peter the Great viewed in Russia today? Because he very, clearly wanted to make Russia sort of a European nation.
Yes, but he also had a very clear sense of what comprised the Russian Empire as well. He and his successors. I mean, we mentioned Finland earlier. In the 19th century, Finland was essentially the domain, the dominion of the Tsars. It was the Grand Duchy, I think, of Finland. It was given this quasi autonomous, but it basically belonged to St. Petersburg and the Tsars. Peter the Great himself. Actually, funny enough, I mean, I live in Limehouse in East London. Just a couple of miles downriver from here, there's a statue of Peter the Great overlooking the Thames in Deptford. And the reason it's there is because he came to Deptford in the 1690s. He was the first Russian Tsar or emperor to leave Russia and actually take stock of this new developing modern world around him. And he lived for a while in Deptford to study the Royal Naval Dockyards. He was fascinated by Britain's growing navy and Britain's nascent kind of empire. He also loved the Greenwich Observatory and all the astronomy that was going on. Although he lived in the house of Sir John Evelyn, I think, and John Evelyn later complained that he was an atrocious tenant. He absolutely trashed the place, apparently. So no more lettings for Peter the Great. But then he took all of this back to Russia, and he established these new kind of certainties for Russia in terms of the scope and scale of what the Russian Empire should be. And I think Putin isn't as outward looking as Peter the Great in the sense that he's stuck within these very rigid nationalist certainties, as far as I can see him. And he's written these historical essays where he sets out, what he considers to be what should be the Russian Empire, what how it should be kind of restored. So it is kind of fascinating. Peter the Great was the one who looked outwards. Putin, you think he's looking outwards, but not. He's kind of inward looking.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. St. Petersburg is, I suppose, it's very accessible for us as a city for those very reasons. But I mean, it has this kind of revolutionary zeal to it, which is fascinating reading. I mean, I'm a huge. I read Eugenie Onegin by Pushkin when I was a very impressionable time in my life. And
best time,
yes. But he is sort of adored in Russia in a way that Shakespeare is here.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
He had a sort of a revolutionary element to him as well, didn't he?
He did, yes. I mean, Alexander Pushkin was I think, off the top of my head, he was born in 1799 and died quite young, as we'll get on to. But having composed Eugenie Onegin and just written a million other extraordinary stories, plays, poems. His most famous poem, one of the most famous poems, The Bronze Horseman, based on the statue of the Tsar Peter on his horse by the field of Mars in St. Petersburg. Which has a supernatural element because the statue comes to life and pursues a clerk through the streets, eventually killing the clerk through fear. That's what Tsars do. But Eugenie Onegin was also, yes, I mean, he backed the Decembrists in 1825. This was the first kindling of Russian Revolution in St. Petersburg. This band of officers who wanted to start dismantling the medieval system of serfdom. And also, they were very worried about the Tsarist succession at the time. Pushkin himself, again, I mean, he's a kind of emblem of the dark romanticism of St. Petersburg, I suppose you'd call it. He was very keen on duels. Duels were illegal in Russia in the 19th century. They were practically, but he fought about 30 of them, and generally nothing happened. Either some shots didn't get fired or people stepped in at the end. But there was one duel with a French officer in 1836. The scene is almost exactly like a duel in Eugenie Onegin, actually, because it's the pre-dawn St. Petersburg sky, the snow on the ground, this forest clearing, and the two men facing each other with pistols. And it's Pushkin who gets shot. I think his opponent gets wounded in the arm as Pushkin struggles to aim his gun. And Pushkin died that night of his injuries. The bullet could be felt under the flesh of his back. It hadn't exited through, and it had gone through his intestines. So his final night was one of absolute horror. But he became this extraordinary sort of literary emblem, deservedly so. Everyone should read Pushkin. It's fantastic stuff. And everyone should read Pushkin at a certain time in their life too. But he was so adored that even Joseph Stalin, who abjured much of the Tsarist kind of flavor of 19th century history, Stalin himself was a huge fan of Pushkin. And on the 100th anniversary of his death in 1937, they had huge festivals in Leningrad, which Stalin sort of said, Pushkin is ours. Pushkin is greater than Shakespeare. So there is this, intense pride. But Pushkin also does have his finger on the pulse of this revolutionary fervor of the city, and also this kind of constant of undercurrent of what we might term romantic or even slightly gothic violence. And then also that undercurrent then comes to the surface again with the assassination in 1881 of Tsar Alexander II, who fell victim to what we would now call a terrorist group called Narodnaya Volia, the People's Will. a band of kind of students and young aristocrats who basically wanted to abolish Russia's monarchy, and wanted to abolish the czars and give freedom to the poor people of the countryside. They'd had the serfdom had been abolished in 1861, but the people who lived on these grand aristocratic estates, the men and women who worked the land, they might as well still have been serfs. They were still living lives that looked more like the 14th century than the 19th century. And Tsar Alexander II was assassinated quite dramatically in the center of St. Petersburg. It was pretty much the world's first suicide bombing, I think. It was one of the young students held the homemade bomb above his head and smashed it down at the Tsar's feet as his coach went past. The Tsar was killed. Eventually, the student was killed. And it led to a whole new era of secret surveillance and persecution in St. Petersburg. The secret police grew ever larger, but ever more secret societies of revolutionaries broke out. So we see the young Vladimir Lenin moving through this increasingly industrial city, handing out forbidden leaflets, his wife-to-be doing the same, giving Sunday evening lessons to working men, apparently about some literature and geography and topography, but also teaching them that there's a new faith in the world and it's socialism. So all of this, the fire was beginning to smolder in the late 19th century, that revolutionary fire. And then by 1917, wham, you get this conflagration that absolutely transfixes the world.
We don't get the revolution, it doesn't begin in Moscow because... No. It isn't that window into the... I mean, exiles returning from the West, I guess it's like geographically easier to get back to
Indeed
Russia.
So. And yes, and through our old friend Finland. So Lenin returning to Russia with the help of Germany in the succession of subsidiary trains, and then arriving triumphantly at St. Petersburg's Finland station, having come overland. And so, yes, the fire then becomes a kind of inferno, but the fire had been smouldering for kind of some years before that. But there was the abortive 1905 revolution, which was sparked off by a massacre before the Winter Palace, where troops set upon a bunch of demonstrators who were simply trying to petition the Tsar on kind of various matters. And at that point, the Tsar was forced to bring in the Duma, a kind of an elected body for the first time ever. So bit by bit, it was all in St. Petersburg where this conflagration happened. Also because St. Petersburg then was the capital of the empire. Moscow was not the capital at that point. St. Petersburg was the Tsarist seat of power. This was where it radiated out, and where they'd grown so used to looking towards Europe. In terms of industry, there was a huge number of Scottish engineers in the city. There was an unusual kind of toing and froing between Scotland and Russia. The architecture we've mentioned earlier, but from the 18th century onwards, the huge preponderance of Italian architects, the architects from elsewhere in Europe, and in turn, this St. Petersburg was sending poets and dancers out into Europe. That was the kind of exchange. It was Sergei Diaghilev of the Ballet Russe started up this extraordinary ballet company, but he was simply taking on a tradition that St. Petersburg had nurtured for the past 150 years. And he took this revolutionary ballet company, established it in Paris. This is before the Russian Revolution, and revolutionized the art world with the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, the hot shock of modernism. So the influence of St. Petersburg is kind of all over. Then, as we've mentioned, the literature that comes out, Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, it's extraordinary. Kind of I mean, if you want to learn about the darkness and the uncanniness of St. Petersburg, it becomes almost a character in Crime and Punishment. The student Raskolnikov, who murders an elderly woman moneylender by splitting her head in two with an axe. It's terrible. It's nightmarish. But the city around him is portrayed like a kind of fever dream. There is this element of St. Petersburg where it's always on the edge of some form of catastrophe. So it's woven. It was woven into the people's kind of understanding of the city and their understanding of themselves.
there's one element to the suffering that happens in the city that is horrifying to read about, and that's the cannibalism during the siege. I know, sort of, we're going back into the siege, but
Oh yeah.
I mean, this is. I mean, you write about it over a number of pages. It's but you described it as really well as amoral because it's difficult to have immorality when you're that desperate, I suppose.
Well, and again, also, I mean, it sounds slightly ludicrous to say, but the context is all. It wasn't just hunger that the people of Leningrad were facing. There's a city at this stage of 1.5 million people. They failed to evacuate most people, including children, because the city was so totally encircled by the Wehrmacht. No escape. I mean, the city is a vast kind of prison, really. But on top of that, the Wehrmacht have hit the power stations, so the electricity is stuttering, water supply is not certain, and suddenly they're faced with the harshest winter they've seen for decades and decades. The temperatures are starting to drop minus 20, 30, minus 43 degrees centigrade at one point. And there's absolutely unimaginable. That, together with continued bombing and shelling, so the city around them is being dismantled, building by building. The bombing raids leaving everyone absolutely delirious with sleeplessness. Then the hunger on top of that. Then the cold on top of that. You're queuing at the bakery from 4:30 in the morning to midday in these freezing temperatures just for your handful of bread, and the bread for your family too. These circumstances are already impossible, but the city had also seen a huge influx of refugees from Estonia, from Latvia, from Lithuania, who were rushing into the city ahead of the murderous Nazi onslaught, the murderous Nazi invasion, and seeking sanctuary in Leningrad. But these refugees didn't have ration cards, and that was in itself a death sentence. No ration card, no food, no handful of bread for you. Now, if you think about it, the bodies, because they can't be buried, because no one could dig into the earth because it's so frozen and they're so weak, the bodies are stacked up like logs in some places, on the edges of cemeteries, in morgues. But there are also bodies lying in the street that have been hit by bombs or killed by some shrapnel. And in temperatures of minus 43, they're perfectly preserved. There's not much in the way of decomposition. So a lot of the cases of cannibalism that we saw in December and January, and that in the desperate, darkest moments of that winter of hunger, were refugee mothers who were looking at these dead bodies and who were looking at their small children and thinking, I have to feed my children somehow. There's no need to tell the children where the meat is coming, but this body is never going to be claimed. No one's going to know, and it can't possibly make any difference. It's kind of food. And so in those circumstances, it's extraordinary now. There were official documents that I think Putin will have had them disappeared into various archives again. But there are official documents where the authorities can see what's going on there. And there is a measure of human understanding. There is a measure of it is a nightmare. It is the last taboo. It's the last bridge of humanity really to be crossed, and they're crossing it. But the authorities can understand why. So in those cases where they did arrest people for the crime of what was called people eating, there were prison sentences, but that was pretty much as kind of harsh as they went. There were other cases where there were other people driven mad with hunger who did become murderers, who would sort of stalk people through the snow and axe them down, and and then dismember them for and that's that's when it becomes absolutely a total horror film. That goes beyond amorality. That obviously is immorality, but at the same time, it's founded in. It's not as if it's not that you understand or excuse it, but it's not wholly beyond comprehension as to why somebody would be so driven mad with desperation to do that.
With this siege in particular, but throughout Russia's history, there is this kind of capacity for suffering in Russia that I guess we're seeing at the moment. I mean, it's very difficult to get numbers of troops killed in the war in Ukraine, but
Yes, and
I've heard
we probably never will either from the Russian side.
right.
They'll always go. It'll take us several regime changes before I suppose we really hear the truth of that. But there does seem to be, but the numbers do seem to be colossal, don't they?
Yeah, I've heard 1 million as
Really
an
good lord,
estimate.
Good Lord. I mean, I saw a figure which said 745,000, which is, it's,
Right.
what's a quarter of a million between
Yeah.
them. It's still an extraordinary number of people in the modern day and age where you'd imagine that wars would be fought electronically or with robots or with some cyborgs. No, we're back to tanks and mines and trenches. It's just a landscape which I never ever thought we would ever see again, particularly in Europe. That
Yeah.
capacity for suffering. I mean, there were two strands, I think, in St. Petersburg. They certainly during the siege, there was one diarist, a woman diarist, who wrote actually when the supply line started to open up again. So, in fact, because of the extraordinary, a quick segue. Quite close to Leningrad, there is a massive, massive, massive inland sea. It's a freshwater lake, but it's the size of an inland sea called Lake Ladoga. And in the winter, it kind of freezes over, so nothing can sail across it. But in that winter, that winter was so particularly harsh that the one good idea the authorities had was, hold on, let's test this ice, because this ice is much, much thicker than it usually is. They sent horses across. Then they realized they could get motorized transport across this incredibly thick ice. It meant an incredibly dangerous journey, going from one end of the lake, the St. Petersburg end, across eastwards to unoccupied bits of Russia, a 35-mile journey across a featureless lake of ice. If you get your navigation wrong, if you head slightly in the wrong direction, you're dead. And on top of that, you've got the Luftwaffe above you bombing the ice. So there were trucks going through it. Nonetheless, trucks started coming from the east bearing food, flour, the non-perishable food items, pasta, all the life-giving stuff. And they made their way in convoys across Lake Ladoga and into the city. And the city, in turn, gave them mothers and children to be evacuated. And the evacuation process across that ice, across the space of 2 months or so, was incredible. I think they got 500,000 people back out of the city across that ice. In terms of suffering, yes, I mean, there's huge amounts of suffering in that. I mean, children who saw the trucks being bombed around them and saw friends going under the ice. But an awareness of suffering too. I mentioned there was a woman diarist who, once the supply lines had got in, she felt able to write in her diary. She was addressing the rest of Europe. She was addressing Western Europe rhetorically. And she said, "Dear Europeans, we are poor, we are dirty, we are ignorant, we are very crude, but we are Scythians." And by this reference, Scythians were a nomadic people, a great warrior race, stretching way back before the birth of Jesus, but stretching into the Middle Ages. But that's suddenly how she saw herself. We are Scythians. We are people of the steppes. And she said, and we have a sixth sense. We have a sixth sense for survival. Now, she said, dear Europeans, are you not afraid of us? And it's an extraordinary kind of tone. In part, she was quoting a writer called Alexander Bloch, but this Russian sense of themselves as Scythians, this is who we most truly are. We are the people of the steppes. We can contend with a furious, harsh natural world in the way that cosseted urban Western Europeans could never begin to understand. But in a curious way, you see in some Wehrmacht diaries, the ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers who are part of this monstrous exterminating force making its way into this completely unfamiliar landscape that to them seemed to stretch on illimitedly into infinity. These were very, very young guys. For a lot of them, this was their first taste of war. They were just drawn into the Wehrmacht. And a lot of them were urban. They were from towns and cities in Germany. All they understood was some borders and some towns that were close by. And suddenly they were in this infinite landscape, which is almost beyond time itself. And they were totally bewildered by this kind of new world. And those who were encircling Leningrad, they, as much as the people of Leningrad suffered with the starvation, the soldiers who encircled the city, they were also there in degrees of minus 43 degrees, and they were sitting still because they didn't understand quite why they couldn't move. They couldn't quite understand why they weren't conquering the city. That was only 15 miles away. They could see it through their binoculars. And what was stopping the commanders saying, right, go in and get them? But there they were. They were just there to stop the people getting out. So there is this kind of the woman who wrote that we are Scythians was in a sense quite right, because the German soldiers were wilting and they were weakening, but the Russians and the Red Army were gaining strength.
Well, that makes me think again of, I suppose, the war in Ukraine. I mean, you've mentioned you have, Russian friends going back to Russia via Turkey.
Mm.
Is that sort of Scythian mindset alive and well today in Russia, as they view, the West as or certainly the European West, now that Trump's changing American policy. But
Yes.
but is this a sort of a view of Europeans, they're not quite getting us, we will endure?
Very definitely. Well, certainly from because a couple of friends are younger, but a couple of the friends are older, and there is certainly a mindset, not totally among them, but among their relatives, that definitely they are the strong ones, because they are used to hardship. They can hang on as long as it would take. And actually, my acquaintance from St. Petersburg, and I have to always be quite careful about not naming anyone, because you just the age as it is, Putin being so sensitive about history. There's so many British historians who are already on his kind of banned forever list, who can never go to Russia ever again. But I know that to even name Russians, it's just absolutely invidious. But my acquaintance from St. Petersburg said that, yes, even St. Petersburg, which is, even to this day, is all ballet and music and opera, as we've mentioned, if put to it, they could go through all sorts of horrors again. Absolutely. Knowing that they would just survive the Western Europeans.
Yeah,
Then there's an element of that with the Ukrainians too, though, because of course, in this, the huge part of the Red Army was the Ukrainian part of the Red Army, and they were among the most ferocious when leading that as a fight back against the Nazi Germany, and then led them across Eastern Europe into Germany and then into Berlin, and the ravaging and the raping of Berlin. The Ukrainians are every bit as ferocious and Scythian as Putin imagines himself to be. I mean, actually, funny enough, the Scythian point, Putin doesn't obviously do it so much now, but all those publicity pictures that Putin used to put out of himself riding topless on horseback through the kind of freezing lakes, and out in the Siberia, in the great wilderness, that was him portraying himself as a Scythian. That was the essence of the Russian soul.
I love that. That's fascinating. I mean, the Scythians appear in ancient Athens as they had a job of ensuring those eligible to vote in Athens as rounding them up to make sure they voted.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Christopher Marlowe, Tamburlaine the Great. He's described as the Scythian shepherd. Again, the great nomad warrior who conquers all in his path and who is at one with the natural world, unlike the decadent, urbanized city folk that he conquers.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. This has been really wonderful, Sinclair. The book is just a real joy to read. I mean, quite difficult moments in it, of course, as we've discussed with the cannibalism. But thank you very much for coming on. And listeners, links are in the show notes. But Sinclair, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history on the way, so please do share with friends and family to help us grow. But until then, thank you and good night.